The convoy rolled through the gates of the captured Luftwaffe base long before dawn, its engines muffled by the fog that crawled across the cracked runway like a living thing. Trucks crept forward under blackout lights, their silhouettes ghostly against the skeletal hangars that loomed ahead. The war was over, yet the air still carried its weight. The scent of burned fuel, the distant echo of artillery from some pocket of resistance that refused to surrender. Inside the lead vehicle, Major William Harrington of the U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Section sat wrapped in his overcoat, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He hadn't slept in 30 hours. None of them had. They were scientists in uniform, scavengers of a dying empire, chasing the ghosts of technology that had once threatened to rewrite the laws of warfare. When the truck stopped, a dozen soldiers jumped down and began unloading the cargo. Long wooden crates marked with black stencils. Heeres Versuchsanstalt, Peenemünde. Each one was stamped with serial codes, most of them burned or scratched out. The Germans had tried to destroy the evidence before retreating, but they hadn't been thorough enough. Inside those crates lay the pieces of something that had terrified an entire continent. Fragments of the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile, the weapon that had screamed out of the upper atmosphere and struck without warning, faster than sound, beyond defense. London had known its voice, that hollow roar followed by the silence of annihilation. Now its remains sat before the Americans, silent, cold, almost reverent in their stillness. The hangar they used for analysis had once housed Messerschmitt fighters. Its glass windows were shattered, its concrete floor smeared with oil and soot. Floodlights cast harsh cones of light across tables covered in mechanical organs. Gyroscopes, fuel pumps, guidance vanes, fragments of the rocket's thin aluminum skin warped by heat. There was no ceremony, no speeches. Harrington gave the order, and the work began. The team comprised engineers from Bell, MIT, and the Army's Ordnance Department. They moved like surgeons, uncrating, documenting, sketching. Every wire was traced, every screw labeled. The Germans had built their rocket in secret, but its remains spoke a universal language: mathematics, mechanics, physics. Harrington bent over the heart of it all, the guidance core. It sat on a steel stand, 3 gyroscopes arranged in a complex lattice of servos, hydraulic pumps, and analog relays. It looked almost alive, a mechanical brain suspended in a cage of precision. The brass surfaces had dulled with soot, and the bearings inside were blackened, scarred by heat. He had studied control systems before the war, taught them even, but this was something else. He could see the intelligence behind every contour, the desperation of a nation that had bet its soul on invention. What he couldn't see was why it had failed. The British reports were clear. Of the thousands of rockets fired, many had missed London by miles, smashing into fields or empty suburbs. It made no sense. The V-2's design was mathematically flawless. Days turned into nights. The analysts slept on cots beside the workbenches, their uniforms permanently stained with grease and graphite. They drank bitter coffee that tasted of metal, the hangar filled with the clatter of tools, the low murmur of translators reading through captured notebooks. Some were written in technical shorthand so dense it resembled scripture. One of them, a thin notebook found near the wreckage of Peenemünde, contained test results from a series of failed launches: velocity drift, altitude variance, angular oscillation. The words repeated again and again: Kreisel fehlerhaft, gyro faulty. Harrington had it pinned open beside him as he and his men wired the core to a power supply for testing. When the gyros spun up, the air changed. A low hum deepened into a trembling whine. The machine began to vibrate, trembling with a rhythm that felt wrong, almost human in its irregularity. The needles on the gauges twitched violently. Harrington leaned close, watching the central gyro's axis blur into a silver halo. For a moment, it stabilized perfectly, a perfect balance of motion and counterforce. Then a faint knocking began, a stutter that spread through the frame. The entire rig shuddered. The needles spiked. Sparks flared at one of the servos. Harrington shouted, and one of the men killed the power. The hangar fell silent, except for the echo of the motor winding down, like a dying heartbeat. He stepped closer. The bearings inside the gyros were unevenly worn, their surfaces pitted and scarred. The Germans had used inferior alloys: copper where there should have been steel, steel where there should have been tungsten. Wartime shortages, he thought. Every small imperfection multiplied when the rocket accelerated through the atmosphere. The gyros lost calibration, the guidance computer tried to compensate, and the missile drifted off course. The flaw wasn't in the design, it was in the execution. Germany had built brilliance out of desperation, precision out of decay. Their weapon missed because their factories were burning. The team continued disassembling every part of the core, tracing its flaws to their origin. They found evidence of sabotage too. Bearings deliberately misaligned, soldering weakly done, forced laborers perhaps, working inside underground factories, risking death to ensure the rockets missed their mark. That discovery silenced the room for a long time. No one spoke. The war had been fought in laboratories as much as on battlefields, and this was where victory had begun, in the quiet defiance of men who broke a machine from within. Outside, the fog had lifted, and the first light of morning spilled through the broken windows. Harrington stepped outside, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. He looked back at the hangar, at the team inside, piecing together the weapon that had once been the future. The V-2 was both a monster and a promise, a glimpse of the world to come. He could already imagine what would follow: missiles that could cross oceans, rockets that could reach the stars. Mankind had opened a door it could never close again. He crushed the cigarette under his boot and went back inside. There was still more to learn, and every piece they uncovered brought them closer to understanding how genius and madness had shared the same blueprint. Tell me where you're watching this from. The discovery of the flaw should have been enough to satisfy the American team, but it didn't. For Harrington and the others, uncovering the weakness of the V-2's guidance core was only the beginning. What haunted them was why it had existed at all, how such brilliance could coexist with such ruin, how a weapon that defied imagination had been born in a country collapsing under its own ashes. The hangar became a temple of questions. Every wire, every dented casing, every German note carried the echo of a mind trying to solve something impossible, under conditions no human being should have endured. Harrington began to sense, almost against his will, a kind of admiration, not for what the Germans had done, but for what they had tried to do. He spent hours staring at the gyroscopes under lamplight, the hum of the generator steady behind him. Outside, the wind rattled the loose panels of the hangar roof. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang over a village that had survived the war by accident, untouched and hollow. The engineers from Bell and MIT debated in low voices, tracing equations in grease on sheets of metal scavenged from the rocket's hull. One of them, a quiet man named Dr. Lewis, believed the gyros' instability wasn't only due to poor materials, but to an underlying design compromise, a decision made when time and fuel calculations clashed with Hitler's deadlines. Every hour of testing led them deeper into the psychology of their enemies. They were no longer just dissecting a machine. They were peeling back the last layers of a dying empire's mind. Each evening they gathered their findings into thick folders to be sent back to Washington and White Sands. But even as they worked, they knew something larger was happening. The Soviets were moving fast. Intelligence reports whispered of their own teams scavenging through the ruins of Peenemünde and Nordhausen, rounding up engineers, hauling crates east by the trainload. The race for knowledge had already begun, and it was not the kind fought with guns. Harrington felt it in his bones. A new war, colder and quieter, fought in laboratories and deserts instead of trenches. He didn't say it aloud, but he saw it in the eyes of every man there. The realization that they were no longer soldiers, but the architects of whatever came next. They began testing the guidance systems under increasingly complex simulations. The hangar was filled with the rhythm of machinery, motors whining, relays clicking, the air thick with the smell of ozone. They built a wooden mock-up of the rocket's control section and wired it to respond to the guidance core. When the system was powered, the fins at the tail began to twitch, small, delicate movements correcting imaginary flight paths. It was eerie, like watching something alive dream of motion. The Germans had truly built an autonomous weapon, a machine that could think, in its own primitive way, about where it was going. Late one night, Harrington found himself alone with the notes of Werner von Braun. They had been confiscated by the Allies and distributed among the analysis teams. The pages were covered in clean, elegant handwriting, filled with equations that spoke of perfect trajectories and escape velocities, but interspersed were darker notes, calculations of payload capacity, destructive yield, and range projections that reached beyond London to New York. He felt a chill reading them. Von Braun had not been building for victory. He had been building for eternity. His dreams had simply outrun his country's ruin. The next morning, a British officer arrived, Colonel Patrick Greaves, representing the team from the Ministry of Supply. He watched the Americans at work with a mix of curiosity and quiet resentment. Britain had suffered under the V-2, and now the weapon's secrets were being sifted by foreign hands on German soil. He asked Harrington if they had determined the reason for the rocket's misses. Harrington explained the faulty alloys, the unstable gyros, the imperfect balance between control and thrust. Greaves nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "So it wasn't mercy, just bad bearings." The line stayed with Harrington for days. That night, he couldn't sleep. The hangar was quiet, except for the creaking of metal and the ticking of a clock someone had hung near the door. He walked among the tables, past the pieces of the disassembled V-2, his shadow stretching over fragments of human invention that had nearly rewritten the meaning of war. He imagined the German technicians assembling these same parts in the underground tunnels of Nordhausen, under the watch of SS guards, surrounded by the dying faces of prisoners forced to labor until their hands bled. Every bolt, every wire, was a monument to suffering. And yet, here it was, laid bare under American lights, being transformed into knowledge. It felt like stealing from the dead. By dawn, frost had gathered on the inside of the hangar window. The engineers were already up, sketching new diagrams of the control algorithm. Harrington looked at the blackboard filled with equations that no longer felt like spoils of war, but blueprints of destiny. They were on the edge of something immense, something that would shape the next century. For the first time, he wondered if understanding the V-2 meant inheriting its curse, the fusion of intellect and destruction. When the next test began, the guidance system responded perfectly. The gyros held stable. The analog computer pulsed with a steady rhythm. The servos hummed like a heartbeat. For one long minute, the machine behaved flawlessly. And in that perfection, the room went utterly silent. Harrington realized they were looking at the seed of a future none of them could stop. The line between weapon and wonder had already vanished. He switched off the power, and the hum faded into stillness. "We're done," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. Outside, the clouds were breaking, sunlight spilling across the field where the wreckage of other rockets waited to be dissected. He looked at them and saw not the end of a war, but the beginning of an age. If you've made it this far, subscribe, because what comes next changes everything they thought they'd won. They transported the reconstructed guidance core to the test range outside Göttingen, a flat expanse of frozen mud and rusted wreckage where the air still smelled faintly of cordite and smoke. The war had left scars everywhere, craters, half-buried shells, abandoned bunkers overgrown with weeds. To the untrained eye, it was a wasteland, but to Harrington's team, it was a laboratory without walls. They had secured permission from Army Command to conduct live calibration trials, the kind that no one wanted to risk inside a hangar again after the near disaster of their last test. The morning the first assembly was rolled into position, the men stood silently, watching the fog rise off the field, as if the earth itself were exhaling ghosts. The rocket's control section, stripped of its warhead, sat atop a steel frame anchored in concrete. The air was cold enough to sting their fingers through gloves. Harrington's breath came out in clouds as he gave the order to power the gyros. The generators growled to life, cables trembling as currents surged through them. A deep hum filled the field, not loud, but heavy, a vibration that pressed against the ribs. The guidance unit began to whir, its spinning masses gathering speed, faster and faster, until the entire frame trembled with energy. For a moment, everything held. Then again, the familiar instability crept in, a faint vibration that spread like sickness through the metal. Dr. Lewis adjusted the trim controls manually, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "She's fighting herself," he muttered. The servos strained, correcting imaginary roll and yaw, and the guidance core bucked against its restraints, as if the ghost of the rocket were trying to launch itself. The sound was unbearable, a metallic shriek wrapped in mechanical rage. Harrington shouted for a shutdown. The noise stopped, leaving a vacuum of silence that made their ears ring. They checked the readouts. The gyro drift had worsened, even under perfect lab conditions. It made no sense. That night, they sat inside a drafty barracks with a single stove and a stack of technical manuals stolen from Peenemünde. Lewis argued that the flaw was mechanical. Harrington suspected something deeper, perhaps a resonance problem caused by the rocket's engine vibration coupling with the gyro mount frequency. It was engineering at the edge of human understanding. Every answer led to more questions. They had entered a labyrinth where mathematics blurred into intuition, and each step forward meant walking deeper into the unknown. Days passed. They rebuilt the core again and again, adjusting angles, swapping bearings, rebalancing gyros. At times the machine behaved perfectly, as if taunting them, then failed the next moment without warning. The instability was unpredictable, almost sentient. The technicians began referring to it as the ghost, a superstition that spread quietly through the team. One night, a generator failed mid-test, and the sudden stop of the gyro's spin released a sound like a scream that echoed across the valley. A young corporal dropped his tools and refused to return to the hangar after dark. Harrington didn't believe in ghosts, but the project had begun to weigh on him like a haunting. The V-2 was more than a weapon. It was a message. He had seen too many burned-out laboratories, too many notebooks written by men who'd gone mad chasing perfection. The Germans had worshipped this machine. They had sacrificed entire cities for it, murdered tens of thousands of slave laborers in the tunnels of Mittelwerk, all to give birth to something that couldn't even aim true. He wondered if that was poetic justice or divine irony. But the engineer in him couldn't stop admiring it. He could almost feel its potential vibrating in his bones, whispering of space, of new frontiers where destruction and discovery were the same thing. Then came the day of the full systems test, a tethered firing of a reconstructed V-2 engine integrated with the guidance module. The command staff from the Allied Technical Section arrived to witness it, along with a handful of scientists from the newly formed Operation Paperclip Evaluation Committee. The Americans wanted to know whether the technology was worth salvaging, and more importantly, whether they could make it theirs. Harrington stood on the platform, clipboard in hand, staring at the enormous test rig that had once been a weapon of terror. The rocket engine below them was half dismantled, yet its presence radiated power. When the countdown began, even the wind seemed to stop. The ignition was instant and violent. A column of flame erupted from the exhaust, white-hot, roaring like a living thing. The sound hit them like a physical blow, shaking the ground. The gyros screamed to life, their signals feeding the fin actuators, guiding the flame's dance against the restraints. For 30 seconds the system worked, beautifully, terrifyingly. The analog computer clicked, servo motors hissed, and the jet of fire adjusted itself in perfect synchronization, maintaining an invisible trajectory toward a sky that no longer held enemies. Then, without warning, a control rod fractured. The feedback loop spiked. One of the gyros oversped, its axis locking for a heartbeat, and the entire frame lurched sideways. Steel bolts snapped. The exhaust cone twisted, sending the blast roaring toward the observation bunker. Harrington dove behind the barrier, the world dissolving into blinding light and thunder. When the engine finally shut down, smoke and dust hung thick in the air. The test stand was half destroyed. The guidance core had torn itself apart, pieces scattered across the field like shrapnel from a dead god. For a long time no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of metal cooling in the cold air. When the smoke cleared, they found the cause again. Material fatigue, a crack that had spread silently through a bolt connecting the gyro housing. The weapon's perfection had been undone by the smallest imperfection imaginable. Harrington crouched beside the wreckage, his hand trembling as he picked up one of the shattered bearings. It gleamed faintly in the light, a speck of flawed steel that had changed the course of history. That evening, he wrote his report. It was clinical, detached, filled with technical language that masked the awe he felt. He knew what the generals wanted to hear, that the German design was brilliant but flawed, dangerous yet promising, that with American resources it could be perfected. And he wrote exactly that. But deep down, he felt a different truth forming, one he couldn't bring himself to say, that by perfecting this machine, they were crossing a line humanity might never come back from. The next morning, he returned alone to the test field. The frost had settled over the ruins of the rocket rig, and steam still rose from the cracked earth. He walked among the fragments, boots crunching on ice and twisted steel. The silence was immense, and for the first time since arriving in Germany, he felt something close to fear. Not of war, but of what came after, of a peace built on weapons too powerful for conscience to control. He picked up a piece of the shattered gyro, small enough to fit in his palm, and slipped it into his pocket. Maybe as a souvenir, maybe as a warning. He didn't know. Where do you stand on something? Would you have wanted them to keep building it, or to bury it forever? Comment below with, the line was already crossed. By the time spring crept into the ruins of Germany, the analysis teams had moved from dissection to reconstruction. The hangars that once held Messerschmitts now echoed with the clatter of American tools and the low murmur of engineers translating dreams born in another tongue. The V-2 project was no longer a mystery to them. It was a mirror. Every breakthrough, every adjustment reflected back their own hunger to understand, to control, to push further than anyone ever had. What began as investigation had become resurrection. They reassembled the guidance unit from the fragments that had survived the explosion at Göttingen. The bearings were replaced with precision components machined from American steel. The analog computer was rewired and calibrated to a degree of accuracy the Germans could have only fantasized about in the final days of the Reich. When it was done, it no longer looked like a German invention. It was cleaner, steadier, its rough edges smoothed by new hands. Harrington stood beside it, cigarette burning between his fingers, and felt both pride and unease. He had helped rebuild the weapon that once rained death on London, and now, in American custody, it pulsed with new life. Every day, convoys came and went. Scientists, soldiers, and crates marked restricted white sands were loaded into transports bound for the West. Men like Werner von Braun, Dornberger, and Debut were already under interrogation or recruitment. Operation Paperclip had begun in earnest, and the line between enemy and ally was dissolving faster than anyone dared admit. Harrington saw them sometimes, the German engineers, pale, exhausted, some still in tattered uniform, escorted under guard, but treated more like prized guests than prisoners. One of them, a thin, bespectacled man named Hans Kammler Jr., son of the notorious SS general, spoke to him during a break in testing. "Do you know what you are holding, Major?" he asked in perfect English. "It's not a bomb, it's a compass. It points to the future." The words stayed with him. A compass. That was exactly what it felt like. A device pointing towards something vast and unknowable. The team had begun discussing trajectories that reached beyond the stratosphere. The same guidance that once targeted London could theoretically be scaled to send a payload into orbit. The equations were there, buried in von Braun's notes. Altitude, velocity, thrust-to-weight ratios. It was all possible. The difference between a missile and a spacecraft was only intent. Harrington realized, with a chill, that the weapon's final flaw, the one that had made it miss its targets, was the only thing that had kept it grounded in the realm of war. Fix it, and mankind would inherit the stars, and the ability to burn the world from above. The test continued. The new gyros performed flawlessly under stress, holding calibration through violent vibration cycles. The analog computer, now tuned with American precision, responded instantly to control input. They had done what the Germans could not. They had perfected it. The first time the rebuilt core completed a full simulation with zero drift, the men in the hangar erupted in applause. Harrington didn't join them. He just watched the machine hum, its steady rhythm both beautiful and terrifying. It wasn't triumph he felt, it was dread. A few nights later, a telegram arrived, ordering him to report to Frankfurt for debriefing with the Allied Research Command. The message was brief, impersonal, but the meaning was clear. The project was moving beyond field study. It was becoming a weapon program. When he arrived, he found the conference room filled with men in pressed uniforms and clean shoes, officers who had never touched a wrench or smelled burnt fuel. They asked him to explain the V-2 guidance in simple terms. He told them what they wanted to hear, that it was reliable, scalable, and adaptable for any purpose. They nodded, satisfied, already speaking of future deterrent capacity and intercontinental applications. He realized they weren't studying the weapon to understand it, they were preparing to own it. After the meeting, he walked outside into the rain. The city was in ruins, streets choked with rubble, children searching for food in the gutters, church bells ringing hollow across empty squares. He thought about the machine he had just described, a device that could reach any point on Earth, and wondered what right any nation had to wield such power. The war had ended with victory, but peace felt like a word spoken too soon. The line between defense and domination was already blurring, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Back at the test site, the engineers had begun constructing a mock launch stand for a full-scale rocket trial. Not a firing, but a systems verification, a symbolic act to show that the American-led team could integrate every captured component into a functioning model. It wasn't meant to fly, yet the energy around the project felt almost religious. Reporters were barred, but high-ranking officers visited constantly, walking the catwalks with hands behind their backs, eyes gleaming with the promise of new power. Harrington watched them from the floor, his hands stained with graphite and oil, and felt sick. These men saw the V-2 not as a relic of horror, but as a prototype for empire. During one of the final calibration tests, the rebuilt guidance unit failed again, but not because of mechanical error. Someone had tampered with it. One of the bearings had been deliberately scratched, just enough to throw the system off. The sabotage was subtle, almost elegant. Harrington's men found it during post-test inspection. No one confessed, but he didn't need to ask. One of the German technicians had done it, Maybe out of guilt, maybe defiance, maybe to make sure that no one, not even their conquerors, could wield perfection without consequence. That night, Harrington walked through the silent hangar. The machines slept under canvas sheets, the air heavy with the smell of oil and dust. He paused beside the guidance core, its surface gleaming under a single bare bulb. For the first time, he reached out and touched it, feeling the cool vibration of metal under his fingertips. He imagined it spinning, alive, reaching for the heavens. He thought of the cities it had destroyed, and the ones it might one day erase. It was beautiful in a way that hurt. The line between awe and fear had never been thinner. He stood there for a long time, until the light flickered and died. Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon. Now I want you to think about, if you were in his place, standing before the first machine capable of touching space, but built for killing, what would you do? Would you keep it alive, or let it die with the war? Comment below with, "We were never ready for the future." The war had been over for months, but for the men in those hangars, it never really ended. The rifles were gone, the uniforms cleaner, but the same cold purpose remained, to outthink the next enemy before he could even exist. Harrington had been transferred to White Sands, New Mexico, along with a small detachment of engineers and scientists from the captured German teams. The desert was their new battlefield. The wind carried dust instead of smoke, and the silence was broken only by the growl of trucks and the sharp echo of engines being tested at dawn. They called it a proving ground, but it felt more like purgatory, a place where the sins of the old world were being reshaped into the weapons of the new. He had imagined freedom when he first saw the desert, wide and endless beneath the blinding sun, but the emptiness only magnified his unease. The first reconstructed V-2 had arrived by rail, packed in sections inside sealed freight cars, its components swaddled in tar paper and waxed cloth like relics from a fallen god. The same serial markings he had seen in Germany were still burned into the metal, Werk number 503715, a ghost number, stamped by hands that were likely dead or imprisoned. The rocket was reassembled under the supervision of both American and former German engineers. Von Braun himself stood nearby, smiling as if he were home again. To the soldiers watching, he was a captured genius. To Harrington, he was something far more complicated. A man who had dreamed of the stars, but climbed to them on a mountain of bones. The heat was merciless. Every surface shimmered, and the horizon seemed to breathe. The men worked in shifts, their faces red with dust and fatigue. They spoke in a mix of languages, English, German, Polish, even bits of Russian from defectors. And yet, beneath it all, there was a strange unity. Everyone wanted to see it fly again, not as a weapon this time, but as proof that they could master it, that they could command the same power that had once terrified them. When the final bolt was tightened and the long, sleek body of the V-2 stood upright against the sky, a hush fell over the camp. It looked alive again, reborn in the sunlight, its black and white pattern gleaming like the skin of some prehistoric creature rediscovered by accident. Harrington found himself standing near the control van during the first launch rehearsal. He held the test logs in his hand, but wasn't really reading them. His eyes were on the rocket, the way it seemed to breathe as the fuel lines were connected, the faint hiss of liquid oxygen venting in the dry air. Von Braun was a few yards away, explaining flight parameters to a group of officers as if he'd never worn the uniform of the enemy. There was something hypnotic in his confidence, something almost innocent in the way he spoke of altitude and thrust, like a child describing the flight of a bird. Harrington felt a flicker of admiration, followed instantly by disgust. The same voice that once promised vengeance for the Reich now promised progress for humanity. Maybe that was the true genius, the ability to change the flag without changing the dream. When the countdown began, every sound seemed to vanish into stillness. 10 seconds, 9, 8. The world held its breath. At 0, the desert erupted. The ground shook, sand leapt from the earth, and a spear of flame tore upward, carving light into the blue. The rocket rose clean, steady, impossibly fast. For a moment, no one spoke. It was perfect. Harrington's chest tightened. The machine that had once been an instrument of terror was now a symbol of victory, not because its purpose had changed, but because its ownership had. The men around him cheered. Officers slapped backs, and Von Braun smiled quietly, as though he'd always known this moment would come. Harrington just stared into the sky until the white trail vanished beyond the clouds. That night, he couldn't sleep. The barracks were quiet except for the hum of the desert wind pressing against the tin walls. He lit a cigarette and sat at the edge of his bunk, staring at the photograph taped to the wall. His wife and daughter, both smiling, taken before he left for Europe. He wondered what kind of world they would inherit now. a world where rockets could carry men beyond the sky, or carry bombs that could erase cities before anyone could scream. The line between wonder and horror had disappeared somewhere between London and White Sands, and he no longer knew which side he stood on. In the days that followed, the V-2 tests became routine. Each launch reached higher, farther, with cleaner data and fewer errors. The headlines would soon celebrate it as a triumph of American ingenuity, but those inside the program knew the truth. The rocket flying over New Mexico was the child of Peenemünde. It was German in birth, American in custody, and universal in consequence. Harrington kept thinking about that cracked gyro bed, the tiny flaw that had once spared lives by forcing those rockets off course. Now that flaw was gone. They had made it perfect. He began keeping a notebook filled with sketches and reflections he never shared. On one page, he wrote a single sentence: "We are learning to aim at the future." On another, he drew the outline of a mushroom cloud, not because he had seen one, but because he could already imagine it. The science of guidance, once confined to steering rockets, was evolving into something larger, something that would soon find its way into atomic warhead. It was all connected: the math, the machinery, the morality. Every number they solved drew them closer to an answer no one could live with. One evening, von Braun approached him in the hangar. The German held a clipboard and a faint smile. "You look troubled, Major," he said. "You should be proud. We are pioneers now." Harrington stared at him for a long moment. Pioneers of what? Von Braun's smile didn't falter. "Of tomorrow," he said softly, and walked away. The desert wind blew through the open doors, scattering sand across the floor. Harrington stayed there long after the lights were out, watching the stars shimmer above the horizon. Somewhere up there, he thought, was the same sky those rockets had once fallen from, but now it belonged to no one, or to everyone willing to reach for it. If you felt that same uneasy pride, that sense of progress born from something broken, subscribe, because the story of what came next isn't just history, it's prophecy. The launches had become routine, yet each one hollowed Harrington a little more. The cheering never sounded right anymore, too bright, too certain, echoing against the emptiness of the desert like laughter in a graveyard. The V-2s rose cleanly into the sky, arcing white through the blue, their thunder rolling across miles of sand until the sound dissolved into silence. Every flight was a success, every equation correct, every piece of data perfect, and with each success came an invisible weight pressing harder on his chest. The machine had lost its mystery. It was no longer a riddle to be solved, but a mirror reflecting what men truly were when the fear of defeat no longer restrained their ambition. He began walking alone after the launches, wandering out into the desert until the camp was a smudge of lights behind him. At first, the emptiness soothed him, the hush, the scent of dust and sage, the vast indifferent sky. But the longer he stood there, the more he felt that same sky staring back, silent and watchful, like an endless courtroom waiting for its verdict. He thought about the faces he had seen in Europe, the prisoners in the tunnels beneath Nordhausen, the civilians digging through rubble in London, the German scientists shaking his hand as if the war had been a misunderstanding instead of a catastrophe. They all lived inside the machinery now. Every test firing was another prayer to the god of progress, paid for with the faith of the dead. Letters from home piled up unopened on his bunk. He had no words to write back. What could he tell his wife? That he was helping build a bridge between hell and heaven, and he no longer knew which side he stood on. The newspapers called the White Sands Project a leap for civilization. Harrington saw only a repetition. Humanity had built towers before, each time convinced they were reaching towards something divine, and each time the smoke rose higher than the prayers. One night, after a long day of calibration work, he found von Braun sitting alone near the launch tower, staring at the horizon. The German greeted him politely, offering a cigarette. They smoked in silence for a while, before Harrington finally asked, "Do you ever think about what they were used for, the people who died under them?" Von Braun exhaled slowly. "Of course," he said, "but thinking does not change physics. Rockets go up. What comes down is decided by whoever holds the launch key." Harrington turned the words over in his mind, bitter and precise. Whoever holds the launch key. That was the entire century condensed into one sentence. When the army announced the next phase, the integration of atomic research with long-range delivery systems, something inside him hardened. It was official now. The guidance system he had perfected would no longer point rockets toward empty sky. It would aim them at coordinates measured in human lives. The excitement around the base reached fever pitch. Journalists called it the dawn of the missile age. Harrington called it something else in his notebook, the mathematics of annihilation. He began to drift from the others, working late, eating alone. The same precision that had once thrilled him now felt like blasphemy. Each equation on the blackboard looked like a confession written in symbols. He started keeping the lights low in the lab, preferring the hum of the machines to the sound of voices. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could still see the V2 rising over the desert, its flame washing the night in silver and gold. Beautiful, terrible, eternal. He wondered if the men at Peenemünde had felt the same contradiction, pride wrapped in guilt, creation disguised as sin. Then came the storm. A launch was scheduled for late afternoon, but a dry thunderfront rolled in over the mountain, the air thick and electric. The officers wanted to postpone, but the scientists insisted on proceeding. The conditions, they argued, were scientifically interesting. Harrington watched from the control bunker as lightning split the horizon. When ignition came, the rocket lifted flawlessly, until a sudden strike hit the exhaust. For a split second, the desert lit up like day. The guidance core shorted, the telemetry spiked, and the rocket veered violently off course. It disintegrated in the upper atmosphere, fragments raining down like burning stars. The shockwave hit minutes later, rolling across the sand in a low, thunderous groan. No one was hurt, but the silence that followed felt heavier than grief. That night, the camp was tense. Officers blamed the weather, engineers blamed grounding errors, but Harrington felt only inevitability. The machine had reminded them that nature was still stronger, that perfection was an illusion built on chance. He sat outside until dawn, staring at the twisted fragments scattered across the dunes, thinking how every advancement still answered to the same law. What goes up must one day fall. He sent his resignation request a week later. It was denied. The project was classified, the work too important, the war too unfinished. So he stayed, a ghost among the living, watching history take shape through equations he no longer believed in. Sometimes, at dusk, he imagined the future, cities built around launch towers, children growing up under skies streaked with contrails instead of clouds. He wanted to believe it would be worth it, that somewhere beyond the fear there would be wonder. But deep down, he knew mankind was already rewriting the meaning of distance. No frontier would ever again be empty. He walked to the edge of the test field one evening, the sand cool under his boots, and whispered to himself, "We've built wings for angels who forgot how to pray." The words vanished into the wind. Tell me in the comments, when progress demands innocence as its price, would you still pay it? Right, we're flying too close already. The desert had grown quieter by summer. The launch towers shimmered under the sun, their steel bones warping in the heat haze. The world outside was changing faster than the wind could carry news of it. Washington spoke of reconstruction, of prosperity, of peace. Yet every morning, before dawn, the generators at White Sands roared to life, and another machine reached for the heaven. The men no longer called them rockets. They called them vehicles, as if changing the word could cleanse its meaning. Harrington kept his distance now, signing papers, attending briefing, pretending that his role had become administrative. In truth, he could not bear to watch another launch. He had seen the film reels of Hiroshima. The reports were classified, but among engineers they circulated like whispers, photographs of shadows burned into walls, of cities turned to glass. The technology was different, but the principle was the same: precision, yield, delivery. The combination was inevitable. He knew, with an ache so deep it became calm, that everything he had studied since that hangar in Germany was leading toward this. The V2 had been the first messenger. What came next would not stop at cities. It would aim at nations, at continents, at the planet itself. Sometimes, after midnight, he climbed the small ridge overlooking the test range and sat alone, smoking, watching the lights blink across the sand. The desert stretched endless and merciless around him, a sea of silence that had swallowed older civilizations whole. He imagined future archaeologists, centuries from now, digging through the ruins of White Sands and finding fragments of their experiments, shards of fuel tanks, melted circuits, maybe a page from one of his notebooks. Would they understand what these things had meant to the men who built them? Would they see progress or madness? Letters from his wife grew shorter. His daughter, now almost 10, had written him once asking if rockets were beautiful. He had stared at the paper for a long time before answering. He wrote that they were, and left it at that. He didn't tell her that every launch felt like watching a promise break free from gravity, only to fall again as ash. When the final demonstration came, a symbolic flight to mark the end of their first phase, Harrington stood at the edge of the crowd. The officers gathered in their uniform, the scientists in their white coats. Von Braun gave a brief speech about exploration, about how the same machines that once carried war could now carry hope. His words floated light as dust, full of the optimism of a man who could erase his past with equations. Harrington listened, silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the rocket waited. The ignition came without ceremony. Flame tore the sky open, the noise shaking the bones of the earth. The rocket rose, perfect in its path, vanishing into the pale blue until it became a star, and then nothing. The applause that followed felt distant, like echoes through water. Harrington turned away before it ended. He walked back to his quarters, the sound fading behind him, and sat at his desk. On the last page of his notebook, he wrote, "We learn to guide machines, but never ourselves." He closed it, set it on the table, and walked outside. The sun was setting over the desert, long shadows stretching toward him like fingers. For a moment, the horizon looked exactly as it had the day he first saw Germany in ruins, a line between what was built and what was broken. He thought of the men he had worked beside, of the machines they had revived, of the sky they had conquered and corrupted. He thought of the world waiting beyond the sand, unaware that the future had already begun to count down. A transport plane passed overhead, its engines droning like a distant heartbeat. Harrington watched it fade into the crimson light and wondered if peace was ever anything more than an intermission between experiments. The desert wind rose, hot and dry, and he let it carry away the smoke from his cigarette, the only offering he had left to the ghosts of both sides. If you followed his story this far, like this and subscribe, because history didn't end with the last. It just changed its guidance system.